72 hours. That's all they gave me. Those were the first words I muttered when I saw the bright red paper slapped onto the front door of my cabin one early morning. It was taped crookedly, the ink bleeding slightly from the overnight dew, but the bold headline was clear as day: Notice of Demolition, 72 hours. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it, my coffee mug still steaming in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, unexpectedly, I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because I already knew the HOA had just signed their own defeat without even realizing it. They thought they were about to scare me into running, but they had no idea whose land they were really standing on. This wasn't just some random cabin slapped together with leftover wood. This cabin was history. It was built by my grandfather decades ago, long before anyone even dreamed of turning this quiet lakeside forest into a neighborhood full of shiny luxury homes. Back then, the land was nothing but trees, wildlife, and peace. My grandfather was one of the first people to buy property here, and he poured his heart into building this cabin by hand. Every log, every nail, every stone in the chimney had a story behind it. When I was a kid, I'd spend summers here fishing with him at dawn, roasting marshmallows by the fire, and listening to him tell stories about how he had to fight tooth and nail to keep this land safe from developers who wanted to strip it bare. When he passed, the cabin came to me, and I swore I'd protect it just like he did. Fast forward a few years and the once sleepy lakeside had transformed into a playground for the wealthy. Developers swooped in, chopped down trees, built giant houses with glass walls and manicured lawns, and suddenly there was a homeowners association claiming to run everything. They built a clubhouse, a pool, tennis courts, and walking trails, then created a board of self-important people who acted like kings and queens. And sitting at the throne was none other than Karen, the infamous HOA president who made it her mission to bully anyone who didn't fit her vision of perfection. My cabin, rustic and old-fashioned, was her favorite target. From the very first day I moved back in, the letters started. At first, they were worded politely: "Your cabin does not meet community design standards. Please repaint in approved colors." I tossed them in the trash. Then came harsher warnings: "Failure to comply will result in fines." I laughed because I wasn't even part of their HOA. Then, Karen herself showed up on my porch one day, heels sinking into the dirt, pointing at the weathered wood of my cabin like it was some kind of crime scene. She sneered, "This shack is lowering property values. Either you fix it or you move it." I told her, point blank, "This cabin isn't going anywhere. And neither am I." She didn't like that answer one bit. So when I saw the 72-hour demolition notice, I knew she had taken things to a new level. According to the paper, my cabin was in violation of HOA bylaws and had to be torn down within 3 days or they would bring in contractors to do it themselves. The arrogance of it all made my blood boil, but it also made me grin. Why? Because I knew something Karen and her little board didn't. They thought I was just some stubborn guy clinging to an old cabin, but in reality, the land beneath not just my home but their precious clubhouse and trails belonged to me. They had been tenants of my family for decades, paying dirt-cheap rent thanks to agreements my grandfather had set up years ago. They were so blinded by their own power trip that they forgot the very ground they walked on wasn't theirs. I took the notice off my door, folded it neatly, and set it on my kitchen table while I poured myself another cup of coffee. I wasn't scared. I wasn't nervous. I was amused. Because the irony of the situation was too perfect. They gave me 72 hours to tear down my cabin. They had no clue that I could give them the same deadline to turn their world upside down. As I sat there sipping my coffee, memories of my grandfather filled my mind. He always said, "Son, never let bullies push you off your land. They'll huff and puff, but at the end of the day, land is power. They can't win if you own the ground under their feet." At the time, I never thought much of it, but right then, staring at that demolition notice, I realized exactly what he meant. Karen thought she could intimidate me with her fancy letterhead and empty threats. But she was about to learn the hard way that the foundation of her little empire rested on soil she didn't control. The rest of that day, I walked around the property, running my hands along the rough wood of the cabin, listening to the creak of the dock as I stepped onto it, watching the sunlight glint off the calm water of the lake. This place wasn't just a building, it was legacy, family, and freedom. No HOA president, no matter how entitled, was going to take that from me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't just going to defend my cabin. I was going to make the HOA regret ever trying to bully me. When the sun set that evening, the cabin glowing in the golden light, I sat on the porch with a notebook and dug out the old lease contracts from my grandfather's files. And there it was, written in black ink, a clause that had been sitting quietly for decades. As the landowner, I had the right to adjust the rent with only 72 hours notice. I couldn't help but laugh again, shaking my head. They gave me 72 hours to tear my home down, and I could give them 72 hours to triple the price of everything they thought they owned. The game was on, and this time, I held all the cards. The next morning, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed those old lease agreements, tucked them neatly into a folder, and headed straight for the HOA office. It was located inside their shiny little clubhouse, the one with polished stone walls and big glass doors, the same clubhouse that sat right on land my grandfather owned. As I walked up the steps, I could already see Karen through the glass, sitting behind her oversized desk with that smug little smirk plastered across her face, the kind of smile that said she thought she had already won. She probably imagined I was coming in to beg for forgiveness, to grovel at her feet and plead with her not to follow through on the demolition threat. She had no idea what was about to hit her. I opened the door, and the sound of my boots echoed across the tile floor. Karen leaned back in her leather chair, folded her arms, and tilted her head with fake sympathy. "Oh, so you got the notice," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Good. We were worried you might try to ignore it like you ignored every other rule." I didn't bother answering her right away. Instead, I walked calmly to the desk, placed the folder down in front of her, and pushed it toward her. She raised one perfectly plucked eyebrow, clearly confused. "What's this?" she asked. "That," I said, leaning forward just enough for her to see the seriousness in my eyes, "is the reason your little demolition notice doesn't mean a thing. And it's also the reason your entire HOA is about to get a reality check you'll never forget." Karen scoffed and opened the folder, flipping through the yellowed pages like they were junk mail. But then, slowly, her expression began to change. The smirk faded. Her eyes narrowed. Her lips parted just slightly as she read line after line. She looked up at me and stammered, What is this supposed to mean?" I leaned back and crossed my arms. "It means exactly what it says. The land beneath this clubhouse, beneath your parking lot, beneath your precious walking trails, is mine. My grandfather leased it to the HOA for pennies decades ago, and you've been paying that same laughable rate ever since. But here's the fun part, I have the legal right to raise your rent at any time with just 72 hours notice." Karen blinked, the color draining from her face. "That's ridiculous. We own this place." "No, you don't," I shot back, keeping my voice calm but firm. "You've been tenants all this time, and you didn't even realize it. Or maybe you never bothered to check. Either way, starting today, your rent is tripled. Effective in 72 hours. Just like the little deadline you gave me." She slammed the folder shut, her face turning bright red. "You can't do this. This is extortion," she barked, raising her voice so loud that a few HOA board members poked their heads out of nearby offices. I picked up the folder and tucked it back under my arm. "It's not extortion, Karen. It's business. Legal business, backed up by signed contracts that your board agreed to decades ago. You tried to scare me with your phony notice. Now I'm giving you a real one." I paused, leaned in closer, and whispered, 72 hours. The look on her face was priceless. She wanted to scream, to throw me out, to call the cops, but deep down she knew she had no ground to stand on. The papers in that folder were ironclad. My grandfather may have been generous with the original terms, but he wasn't stupid. He made sure the lease protected our family's rights, and now it was coming back to bite Karen and her little empire hard. I turned and walked out of that office as calmly as I had walked in, my boots echoing once again on the tile. Behind me, I could hear Karen's voice rising in panic as she called out to the other board members. "Get the lawyers. Find a way out of this. He can't do this to us." But the truth was, I could, and I just did. By the time I made it back to my cabin, word was already spreading. One of the board members must have texted a homeowner, who told another, until the entire neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the lake, I could see small groups of neighbors gathering outside, whispering angrily, their faces twisted with confusion and fear. They didn't know whether to believe it yet, but soon they would. The next day, I got my confirmation. At exactly 10 a.m., I received a knock on my door. It wasn't Karen this time, it was two other board members, a man in a golf shirt and a woman holding a clipboard. They looked nervous, like kids caught sneaking into the cookie jar. "We just want to talk," the man said quickly, raising his hands as if I might slam the door on them. I let them in and watched as they shuffled awkwardly into my living room. The woman cleared her throat and said, "Look, we think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Surely you can't just raise the rent overnight like this. The HOA can't afford." I cut her off, holding up the contracts. "No misunderstanding. Read it yourself. Clause 13. I can raise the rent with 72 hours notice. And I just did. Legally. If you can't afford it, that's not my problem." The man sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "Do you have any idea what this will do to the homeowners? Their fees will skyrocket. People are going to be furious." I leaned forward and looked him square in the eye. Good. Maybe they should have thought twice before electing someone like Karen, who decided to threaten me with a bogus demolition notice. Actions have consequences. They had nothing else to say. After a few more weak attempts to bargain, they left, shoulders slumped, faces pale. And that's when I knew, the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, the HOA was on the defensive, scrambling to figure out how to deal with me. They had tried to intimidate me, but I had flipped the script. They wanted me gone. Now, they couldn't afford to lose me. That night, I sat on the porch of my cabin with a grin on my face, listening to the crickets chirp and the gentle waves lap against the dock. I thought about how quickly things had turned. Just 2 days earlier, I had been staring at a demolition notice, wondering how far the HOA would go to push me out. Now, it was them who had 72 hours to figure out how they were going to pay triple rent, or face the reality of losing their precious clubhouse, trails, and amenities. And deep down, I knew one thing for certain, this was only the beginning. By the time the 72-hour deadline hit, the entire neighborhood was on fire with anger and panic, but none of it was aimed at me. It was all aimed squarely at the HOA board and especially at Karen. Homeowners who had once strutted around the lake in their tennis whites, sipping wine on their docks, were now storming into HOA meetings demanding answers. I didn't even have to be there. I could hear the shouting from my cabin porch across the water. People were furious, waving their monthly fee statements in the air, yelling about how much more they'd have to pay now that the rent had tripled. One man shouted, "How could you idiots not know we were renting the land?" Another woman snapped, "We trusted you with our money and you blew it." Karen, of course, tried to keep her cool. She stood at the front of the clubhouse, insisting everything was under control, that the lawyers would sort it out. But the more she talked, the more it became clear she had no plan. The board members who had been so loyal to her were now avoiding eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in their seats as homeowners hurled accusations at them. It was chaos, pure and simple. Meanwhile, I was enjoying every minute of it. For once, I wasn't the one being targeted. I wasn't the outsider with the ugly cabin ruining their lake aesthetic. No, now I was the landlord who held all the cards, and Karen was the one looking like a fool. It felt like the universe had flipped the script overnight. Of course, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. A few days later, she marched straight to my cabin with 2 burly-looking security guards in tow. She came stomping up my porch steps, waving a piece of paper in the air like it was some kind of weapon. "This isn't over," she barked, her face red with fury. "You can't just raise the rent like this. It's extortion. I'll have you arrested." I stayed seated in my rocking chair, sipping my coffee as the 2 guards flanked her like they were about to drag me away. But the truth was, they didn't look too convinced. They shifted uncomfortably, like even they knew she was bluffing. Without saying a word, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped record and held it up so everyone could see. "Karen," I said calmly, "extortion is when you threaten someone illegally to take their money. What I'm doing is enforcing a contract your board signed decades ago. You don't like it? Take it up with your lawyers. But if you or your goons step 1 foot inside my cabin, I'll have the sheriff here before you can blink." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She looked to her guards for backup, but one of them just shrugged and muttered, "Ma'am, this looks legal. Maybe we should leave." The other one nodded nervously, clearly not wanting to get dragged into whatever mess this was. For the first time since I'd known her, Karen looked powerless. Completely powerless. She snatched the paper back into her purse, spun on her heel, and stormed off the porch with her heels clacking against the wood like gunshots. The guards followed, trying not to laugh. After that, the tension only grew. Homeowners started confronting Karen in public. I'd see them at the lake dock or the walking trails, shouting at her, demanding she resign. "We can't afford these fees," one man yelled loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "You told us the land was ours," another woman screamed. Every time she tried to talk, people cut her off. Her authority was crumbling right in front of her eyes. But the funniest part? Some of those very same homeowners who had once sneered at me for living in a shack were now stopping by my cabin to shake my hand. One couple even brought me a pie and said, "We never realized you were the one keeping this community running. Thank you for standing up to them." It was surreal. The same people who once wanted me gone were now treating me like some kind of local hero. Still, Karen wasn't done scheming. A week later, I caught her and a few board members meeting with a group of men in suits outside the clubhouse. They were lawyers, no doubt, flipping through thick binders and pointing at maps of the property. They were desperate to find some loophole, some way to weasel out of the lease agreements. But what they didn't know was that my grandfather had been smarter than all of them combined. He had tied those contracts up so tightly that not even the slickest lawyer could undo them without my signature. And they weren't getting that. Eventually, the HOA tried one last stunt. They filed a complaint with the county, claiming my cabin was a safety hazard and needed to be condemned. But when the county inspector came out to take a look, he shook my hand, admired the craftsmanship of the old log beams, and said, "This place is solid. Safer than half the houses up the road." He filed his report, clearing me of any violations. When Karen found out, she nearly exploded. By now, the HOA meetings had become full-blown shouting matches. Homeowners were demanding Karen step down, accusing her of lying, wasting their money, and dragging the entire neighborhood into disaster. I didn't even have to attend, the reports came straight to me from neighbors who were fed up with her nonsense. They told me how people were screaming things like, "We'll sue the board," and "You've ruined this community." And through it all, I stayed calm. I tended to my garden, fixed up my dock, and took long fishing trips on the lake. Every time I walked past the clubhouse, I'd smile, knowing they were paying me 3 times what they used to just to keep the lights on. The same building Karen once bragged about, the same clubhouse she used to host her smug little meetings, was now the very thing draining their budget dry. It was almost poetic, really. She had tried to use power she didn't actually have to take away my home. Instead, she had exposed the truth about her own weakness. She had thought the HOA was untouchable, but now it was clear, they were only as strong as the land beneath their feet. And that land was mine. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to shout, I didn't have to fight, I didn't even have to lift a finger. All I had to do was show them the truth. And once they saw it, everything started crumbling around Karen faster than she could stop it. But even then, I had a feeling the real fallout was still to come. It didn't take long for the cracks to turn into a complete collapse. Within a month of the rent hike, the HOA was bleeding money. Homeowners who had once proudly paid their dues were now furious at the sharp increase. The community that once looked polished and perfect suddenly had weeds growing around the tennis courts, lights burned out in the clubhouse, and the pool maintenance cut back to the bare minimum. The board tried to cover it up, but everyone knew the truth, the HOA couldn't keep up with its new obligations. And instead of blaming me, the people blamed the ones who had gotten them into this mess, Karen and her board. At one of the biggest meetings yet, the anger reached its peak. Dozens of homeowners crowded into the clubhouse, some standing with arms crossed, others waving paperwork in the air. The shouts echoed so loudly across the lake that I could hear it from my porch. "You lied to us," someone bellowed. "You told us the land was ours," another woman screamed. Karen tried to keep control, banging a gavel on the table and demanding order, but nobody was listening. One man, red-faced and furious, marched right up to her podium and slammed his HOA fee statement down. "You expect me to pay triple just because you couldn't do your job? No way. I want you gone." The crowd erupted in cheers and clapping. That was the night Karen lost her crown. The board, desperate to save themselves, called for a vote of no confidence. The motion passed with overwhelming support. Just like that, Karen was out. She stormed out of the clubhouse, her face twisted in rage, muttering about how everyone would regret this. She climbed into her shiny SUV, slammed the door, and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust behind her. The same woman who had once strutted around like Queen of the Lake was now dethroned, humiliated, and abandoned by the very people she thought adored her. But my story didn't end there. Because once Karen was gone, the new board had to face reality. They came to me with hats in their hands, trying to negotiate. "Maybe we can work something out," they said. "Maybe we can reduce the rent increase, find some middle ground." I listened politely, but the truth was, I had no reason to back down. They had threatened to tear down my home, they had tried to bully me into submission, and they had dragged my grandfather's legacy through the mud. No, they were going to pay what they owed. I told them, "This isn't personal anymore. This is business. You've benefited from my family's generosity for decades. Now you're paying market value. Simple as that." They didn't like it, but they had no choice. The contracts were ironclad, and they knew any fight in court would only drain them more. Meanwhile, I used the extra rent money wisely. I invested in the cabin, turning what they once called a shack into something even better. I rebuilt the porch with fresh timber, upgraded the dock with stronger posts, added a new roof, and even put in a stone fire pit out back where friends and neighbors could gather. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen had wanted the cabin gone because it ruined the aesthetic, but now it was the nicest feature on the lake. People walked by and admired it, nodding in approval. Some even asked me if I'd consider renting it out for weekend getaways. Funny how things change. The longer the new rent stood, the more the HOA struggled. Fees went up again, and more homeowners grew restless. For sale signs started popping up in front yards like weeds. The once exclusive neighborhood began to look like a place people couldn't wait to escape. And every time a homeowner complained, they didn't come to me, they went to the board. They knew I wasn't the problem. I was simply the landowner exercising my rights. The problem was the arrogance and incompetence of the people they had once trusted. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, an older man from down the road stopped by. He was one of the original homeowners, someone who had lived here since the early days. He shook my hand and said, "You know, your grandfather would be proud. He always said this place should belong to the people who respect the land, not the ones who just want to control it. You reminded them who really holds the power here." That stuck with me. Because it was never just about money or contracts, it was about standing up to bullies who thought they could rewrite history. Karen believed that because she had a title and a clipboard, she could erase my family's legacy. She thought intimidation would work. She thought she could scare me into submission. Instead, she ended up destroying her own reputation and wrecking the very community she claimed to protect. Months later, I heard through the grapevine that Karen had moved to another state. She tried to get onto another HOA board in her new neighborhood, but word travels fast. People knew about her meltdown at the lake, about how she'd been kicked out in disgrace. No one wanted her anywhere near a position of power again. She became a joke, a cautionary tale of what happens when arrogance collides with reality. As for me, life at the cabin became peaceful again. The neighbors who stayed learned to live with the higher fees, and some even admitted it was better this way. They said the new board was more careful, more respectful, more transparent. It was almost like the whole ordeal had forced them to grow up. And every time I saw them walking the trails or relaxing at the clubhouse, I couldn't help but smile. Because whether they admitted it or not, they were paying me for the privilege. So when people ask me what happened with the HOA, I tell them the truth. They gave me 72 hours to tear down my cabin, but I gave them 72 hours to triple their rent. And I won. Not by yelling, not by fighting, not by stooping to their level, but by using the very rules they ignored. And to this day, every time I sit on my porch with a coffee in hand, watching the lake shimmer in the morning light, I can't help but think back to that bright red notice and smile. Because that piece of paper wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs falling apart. And the best part? My cabin, the one they wanted gone, still stands strong, while their empire crumbled under its own arrogance.